Well, good morning, Bob, and thank you for sharing this time with me to talk about Leading Beyond Sustainability, a new book that I'm writing, and within which I will be having a personal encounter with you as one of the case studies under the chapter of wisdom. But let me give a brief canter through the book so that people have a little bit of context. And then as quick as I can, I'd like to hear some thoughts from you. So I'm going to share my screen. And so the book is Leading Beyond Sustainability, and it's talking about an inspiring vision for the future beyond 2030. 2030, of course, is the target date for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, but in a way that's kind of coincidental. So first of all, a thought, which is that when a karate master wants to smash that plank of wood or piece of stone, they don't look at it, they look beyond it. If they looked at it, they would fail to actually destroy that target. So it's the same with sustainability. Well, that's my suggestion, that if we focus too much on the problem, we will miss the opportunity to make the world a better place. And whilst that's not saying anything against people that are doing amazing work to sort out things like poverty, hunger, climate change, and so on, there is also merit in looking way beyond that to the paradise that we'd like to create. And within my book, I quote a number of references, including your own, Bob, but the three that I'm mentioning here are two from the RethinkX think tank in California, Rethinking Humanity, and Brighter. Brighter is the new book from Adam Dorr, which talks about optimism for environmentalists. And it's really to do with all the amazing work and technology that is coming down the pipeline in the coming decade or so, and how, if as long as we don't mess it up, we should be in for a much brighter future before very long at all. And it's happening at such a rate of knots. The book in the middle there is Steven Pinker, whose work I've admired for quite some time because of his focus on rationality, and that's the title of the new book, which is really looking at data to understand how the world is changing. But there'll be more of that in the book. And today I really want to get into conversation with you, Bob. So in terms of this better world, I talk about 6 aspirations for this better future. And starting in the middle at the top, which is a good place to start, actually, it's very much about connection, which is collaboration, compassion, and love and kindness. And then to either side, we've got peace, which I define as no war and declining violence. And then to the right, abundance of food, water, energy, services, and wealth. And then down at the bottom, starting with the sides, vitality, which I define as health and well-being for all of life, not just humanity, and opportunity for learning, growth, and contribution. And finally, the subject that I'm putting the case study in about you, Bob, is wisdom to do the right thing the right way at the right time. Before I move on to the final slides, any thoughts on that as a future that you may or may not wish to see?
No, it's a beautiful set. We'll talk more about, I think we'll talk more about them as we go, but the only thing I would sort of jump in here and say, connection, the deeper connection to reality itself, to the reality that we are all each other, and that there is no separation, that these principles emerge from that deep experience of or connection to. So connection's a very important point. The only other thought I had was that these apply to all of us and to all beings on the planet. So like when I look at opportunity, I think of how many of us are not included. And you and I come from privilege, right? We're included. Many are not. So how do we bend, as King says, how do we bend toward justice, toward equal inclusion, opportunity, involvement, belonging? That's critical to our future. And it
Those are,
crosses over with abundance and so on. But that's an important emergent body of work or unfolding on the planet right now.
thank you, Bob. And to be honest, when I was wondering which of these 6 aspirations to include you in, I could have picked almost any of them. Even vitality there, because I know of the amazing work that you and Bill Adams are doing on mangroves to help improve the ecology and climate change. I could have literally done a case study on you for any of them, but I chose wisdom because when I think of wise people, and I tried to make a list of all the wise people I knew, you were right in there and up at the top. So I'm very privileged to have this conversation with you today. But I absolutely take the point, especially for opportunity. It's not opportunity for a privileged few, it's opportunity for all humans and all of life on this planet. So thank you for those thoughts. And so the topic that we're going to talk briefly about today is profound wisdom. And there you are. So these are some wise words that I'm quoting in the book from you, and saying a little bit more than that in the book as well. But for today, these 2 paragraphs were fundamental to some of the thinking that I've heard from you and which really resonates. And so that whole idea of creating a new and thriving planetary future, and then almost exactly as you said earlier on, the means to do it is all about connection. It's that idea that we're not separate, but we are one with the inherent unity of all things. So I wondered if you'd like to say a little bit about those 2 thoughts, and then partway through I'll stop sharing the screen, but you just continue because I know people will want to see and hear you, Bob.
Well, one of the things that I'll start with the first quote. One of the things that I'm becoming more aware of is, we've talked for years about complexity and VUCA, and now the words BANI, and with the realization that things are becoming almost unmanageably complex, and that leaders are challenged with this, and that puts a demand on consciousness, conscious evolution, that we evolve to be more and more of a match for the complexities we face. But I think it's beyond that now, and it may have been for quite some time, that not only are leaders challenged to create a successful future for the organization, in the midst of all that, they're challenged with how do we reposition our organization, literally reinvent our organization to contribute to the future of the planet, to be a part of the solution, looking past the obstacle and say, how do we create that business? And we have examples of that that we can talk about because it's public, in the public press. I mean, Honda, for example, the largest manufacturer of internal combustion engines in the world, has a new vision for the organization, which they call the second founding. They literally have to refound the business, and they want to be all electric by 2050, but 85% all electric by 2035. They want no waste in their vehicle. So cradle to grave, it's a circular system. Carbon free as a company. All the energy that they use will be green. No fatalities, which gets to your vitality and health, you know. No fatalities in one of our vehicles. We think we can design them that well with emergent technology that nobody dies in traffic accidents. And then, of course, the diversity and inclusion goals. Well, that's I mean, the level of complexity to not only thrive with their current business, but in the midst of that, to be, you know, they're world leaders, so they have to maintain that. They can't lose that. They have to continue to invent in their current product offerings and reinvent the entire business at the same time with the same resources. It's not like they can double their resources. Well, nobody knows how to do that. And yet they're committed and they will. And this is how I think business is going to carry the day here. If we can all do what they're doing in our own way and as radically. And that puts a tremendous challenge on leaders that they invent from the unknown. Like there's no playbook here. It's unfigureoutable. It's unpredictable. Nobody knows how to do it, and nobody's smart enough to figure this out. So it's going to take a collective wisdom or the capacity to tap the inherent intelligence that's already there. That future needs us. It lies in waiting for us to discern it and build it. And this is what some companies that we're involved with are committed to. It's really quite remarkable.
Yeah.
And that's a leadership challenge that's beyond what we call creative leadership, which is a level of leadership that only about 80% of leaders, only about 20% of leaders really step fully into. And it's what we call now integral leadership, which is a higher order of leadership altogether. And I don't want to get into all of what that is, but I'm calling it unity-informed integral leadership, which gets to the second quote, right? The first, we have to reinvent. We have to start from ground zero, from 0 point. There's so much off about our current model, and we see it imploding. And we know that time is short. And it's not a fix here and a fix there and an adjustment here. It's literally a rewrite. It's a second founding from first principle, which is the inherent unity of all things. So, you know, in Honda's, you know, we're going to recycle everything. Well, there is no way. That's an idea built in separateness, that there's an over there, that there's an away, that the planet is separate from us, that we're not one with. You mentioned the mangrove. We're doing a project this year deep in the Amazon. And this indigenous wisdom is, we don't have the forest. We are the forest. We're not separate from the forest. We are part of that ecosystem. And so this is first principle. Everything is an inherent, unbroken wholeness, an inherent unity. And until we get that right, we're not going to get it right. And your 6 principles, if you will, or aspirations, emerge from the presumption of unity, if not the realization of, and those are different. Presumption is a principle. Realization of it directly is spiritual awareness, a very high order of consciousness.
It's almost as if these 6 aspirations, or however it gets articulated, this idea of a better future is written on our hearts. It's as if it is part of all of us and part of the one, as you describe. And it reminds me, and I think this is what informed me in the first place, when the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals came out in 2015, I started to go around universities, businesses, professional institutions, basically anybody that would have me, Bob. And I would start by taking people into a guided meditation to the year 2030. And I would get people to close their eyes and envisage the future that they wanted to see. A realistic future, but the future that they desperately wanted to see. And the more I did this, the more I realized that, you know what, it's the same every time. It didn't matter which part of the world I was doing this in, didn't matter what age group, it was always the same. And there were such powerful moments during those times. I remember a young girl, I think she was about 8 or something like that, and she was at a primary school. And when we did the exercise, she went on the journey, the same as everybody else. And she said, "Mr. Wilson, I'd like to tell you where I went." So I said, "Go on then, where did you go?" And this was a girl in a school in Leeds in the United Kingdom. She said, "I went to Syria." And I said, "And what did you see in Syria?" She said, "I saw children playing in a playground, and they were all happy and smiling and laughing, and their parents and others were sitting in cafes on the street outside the playground. Some of them had their laptops out on the tables." And her final words were, "And the buildings were beautiful." And this was at a time when there was a lot of conflict in Syria. And every time I tell that story, it gets me here, and I feel it very much. And so many stories, but they were all describing the same future, everybody, no matter where they were. And I think it's a little bit as Mark Carney, the ex-governor of the Bank of England, a Canadian, Bob, he talks about the sunset sector. And when you were talking about reinventing ourselves and looking to that future, as Ponder is doing, that we have that choice, don't we? We have that choice as to whether we're part of what he calls the sunset sector, in other words, on our way out, or are we part of the emerging future? And in which case, in what way? And so many organizations, I would welcome your thoughts on this, don't even realize the power of what they're doing. I was working with a senior leadership team in Wales the other day, literally less than a month ago, and we were talking about their purpose. And this is a company that manufactures ducting, so ventilation systems, and that's what they thought they did, until we dived down a little bit deeper into their purpose, and we discovered that most of their ducting systems ended up in hospitals and pharmaceutical laboratories. So they're really part of the team that saves lives by the thousand. But they hadn't realized that until we had a conversation. What are your thoughts?
Well, first I was struck by your picture when you introduced wisdom on the slide of a woman's face crying tear. And as I listened to your young girl's vision, it's both beautiful and heartbreaking. So part of wisdom, part of this experience of taking in the inherent unity and to be truly open-hearted, compassionate, as you say, is to feel the suffering, is to take on the suffering. And so your story got to me.
I think the fact that we can feel it, Bob, is indicative of exactly what you're talking about, the unity bit, because when somebody else has that vision and they tell it to us, we feel it because we are them. It's exactly what you're talking about.
You know, I just met a man, his name is Orland Bishop. He's a Black man, lives in the States, from Guyana originally, and he deep purveyor of the indigenous African wisdom. And he speaks from remembrance of our inherent unity.
Mm.
He speaks from what the soul knows about why it's here and what it's up to, and a remembrance. So a story like that reminds us of what we remember. King called it the beloved community. And what Orland would suggest is that we come from that. I'm speaking for him. I'm just getting to know him, so I may misrepresent, his way of holding, but we come from a beloved community.
Mm.
And those who've had mystical experiences know this, and so we do all want the same thing. And it touches us deeply, a story like you tell, because we remember. And but our current order is built on the opposite principle, excuse me, of unity. It's built on separateness, and it's built on difference, and it's built on fear that emerges when I have to protect my separateness from your difference. And it's built on, therefore, scarcity versus your principle of abundance, and so on. And it can't work. I remember coming to this conclusion studying economics in college. That's my undergraduate degree. And I was at a Jesuit university, and I was also deeply exploring my various faith traditions, but Christian tradition, but I was also deeply enamored with at the time, and starting to really study and dive into Zen Buddhism,
Mm-hmm.
seeing the commonalities. And I remember having a conversation with the head of the economics department, a Jesuit priest, saying the core principle here of self-interest and the invisible hand that everyone acting in self-interest maximizes the good for all is a false principle. Maximizing profit is a false principle. It can't work. And I was challenging him ethically as a priest, like, how can you lead a business school? And he had his argument for that. But I remember then on retreat, seeing deep into a retreat, this was in college, 8-day Jesuit retreat. I had this whole vision that it's gonna implode. It's gonna come apart, and it's gonna come apart in my lifetime. And we're there now. And so this is what I mean by I have to start at 0 point and rewrite from ground up, from first principle. Because we've organized the whole of society, at least modern society, on a false principle. And that's going to take an order of wisdom and leadership that's rare, and yet necessary. And so I'm calling that unity-informed integral leadership. Integral meaning kind of a later stage of leaders that about 5% of leaders adopt, but it's also a level of leadership that where the old narrative of my identity, this old separate self narrative, starts to be seen as just that. It's a construct. It's something I make up. And as that happens, I'm more porous to the larger reality that's cohering a seemingly separate me. And I'm fascinated right now, and have been for years. I've been studying quantum physics, and what I'm realizing is that the mystics of all traditions and the physicists are describing the same fundamental reality.
Exactly.
Different language, different methodologies, but describing the same reality. What physics is adding, to some degree adding, is a mechanical understanding of how reality actually operates, and how we can, if we really understand that, and most people don't yet understand the paradigm shifting impact of what physicists are saying about the nature of reality.
Yes. There's something about how quantum physicists talk about entanglement.
Yeah.
Which, when we understand it, it helps to inform and make sense of unity. The fact that we're not as separate as we think we are.
Yeah, and capacities like intuition. Not only do many of the great scientists describe that capacity in great detail as central, but we largely dismiss it in our rationalist, separatist paradigm. And I talked about having to access this emergent future. Well, this is where it comes from. We don't know how. And we have to be informed by, as Thoreau said, we lie in the lap of immense intelligence. We are the receivers of its truth and the organs of its activity. Well, this is now not philosophy or metaphysics, it's physics.
Yes.
And I interviewed, again, something we're going to publish this week, David Weavers. David Weavers is a renowned neurologist worldwide. Stuff in 370 academic peer-reviewed publications, 7 textbooks. He's a faculty all over the world at different, medical institutions. Led the Mayo Clinic, not the whole institution, but the neurology aspect of it. And so he's got an impeccable pedigree, really. And he's been a student of consciousness. And he wrote a book, the first line of which says, your brain is not responsible for your consciousness, nor your thinking. And this is, then he goes on point by point by point by point, but citing all the research and so on, neurological research, quantum biological research and so on, to show that, to suggest strongly that the brain transceives a larger field of intelligence, that the thinking is happening in the quantum realm, and the brain is a step down unit, stepping down higher order frequencies into electrochemical pulses and waves. And as such is both a marvelous creation or marvelous mechanism, but also very limiting. It actually limits a lot of what is possible, and there are ways to access more. And he describes, and I had to coax this out of him because he's very humble. I asked him if he had an example of what in his own life of what he calls thought balls, these downloads of information where you get the whole thing in an instant, and it's a revolutionary idea, and then you have to unpack it because there's so much embedded in it. He calls it a thought ball, and he's saying humbly, well, and the story I'll try to shortcut it, goes something like, the entire world of neurology was vexed by competing research on strokes, aneurysms in the brain. One set, very thoroughly researched, said, I think it was something like 7 millimeters, no problem, or something like that. And then another said 10 millimeters, 7 millimeters, it's a real problem. 10 millimeters, when they did autopsies, like, people don't die. I don't have the science right. They couldn't rectify these two really thorough bodies of research. They were saying opposite things about whether we needed to operate or not. And he was part of that worldwide conversation. Nobody could figure it out. And he was walking out of his house one day, and boom, he got the whole thing in a thought ball. And it took him 20 years of research to validate it.
Wow.
The whole world participated, and every aspect of that download was proven out.
Gosh, that reminds me of the journey that I've been on for the last 20 odd years, where at the back end of the 1990s, and funnily enough, I'd just been studying Buddhism for 10 years at the time. And I came to the conclusion that everything was about purpose. That was the conclusion I came to, and it set me off on a journey that I'm still on purposeful leadership, as you know, Bob. Yeah. And it's strange. I had what I'm sure must have been a thought ball. I didn't think of it as such, but only this morning I woke up. I've been thinking, must have been thinking and joining a few dots, but I thought to myself, it's all about life cycles. And I got so enthusiastic. My wife said, what has got into you? I said, I've just realized that, the research from the likes of Tony Sieber and Adam Dorr at the Rethink X that talk about S curves, and S curves in terms of the rate of take-up of new technologies during disruption. And the work that was done, well, it must be 30 years ago, by Charles Handy about sigmoid curves and the life cycle of an organization. And Jerry Faust, who I studied probably about 20 years ago, and he talked about life cycles of organizations and premature aging and premature death in companies and how they get called, how it all happens. And all of a sudden, all these different theories and philosophies, I suddenly just joined up, and it's all about life cycles, one way or another, whether it's the life cycle of an organization, of an era, of an individual, of a product. And this is what it's all about. And it's exactly as you've said, is that some things need to die. They need to follow that downward trajectory, and some things need to happen, and they will. And our choice is whether we're on the side of emergence or whether we're trying to somehow keep the destructive ways going longer than they ought to be.
Yeah, and I want to just play on that in terms of that's how it works. And partly your experience too of getting it all at once, seeing all the interconnections and feeling the joy of that.
Yes.
That Einstein talked about his discovery, which was intuitive, his discoveries. He said intellect has little to do on the road to discovery, not to then figuring it out, working it out. But what his discovery of gravity, which was the core of the theory of relativity, is really a theory of gravity.
Yes.
Was the happiest moment of his life.
Yeah.
And so when these thought balls ride in, our experience is like, oh, and it's coming in on a wave of energy, information, grace, and it's joyful. It's the happiest thought of my life, as Einstein said. So there's, we've been in and around the wisdom traditions and the healing and energetic work traditions. Like in the healing tradition, I spent quite a few years in a school of energy healing. You're learning to open up higher sense perceptions and then work in the field directly, in the energy field directly. And all that sounds like new age woo-woo, but as I've studied physics, no, that's actually reality. There's only a field. There's only a quantum field.
Yes, exactly.
Full stop. It has different frequencies, some of which look like matter. But in physics, there's no matter. There's only a field.
Bob, at the start of this conversation, you reminded me that you have a meeting in precisely a minute's time.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So we could talk for hours. I know we could, and we have done.
Yeah.
But
well, let me just drop in one where I was going with all that. There are ways in which we as human beings and leaders can learn to up the probability of having thought balls. And indirectly the area in which we're most intensively needing to know. And that's a developable capacity, both individually and then in what the field has called dialogue, to sit collectively and cohere a collective field and conversation that predisposes us to breakthrough insight.
wow.
That is a capacity through which the emergent future can
Manifest.
find us.
Yeah.
And then the reverse of that, we can be informed by it, but we also, through our intention, especially at higher levels of awareness and with the same techniques, the same capability, can intention the field. It's not only that we can receive it, but we can actually shape it.
Because we are it.
Because we are it, and we're a co-creative influence, and our consciousness influences what's going to manifest. And so what we hold in consciousness manifests, but we can also hold that at higher levels of energy and frequency and power for manifestation, both individually and collectively. And these are, I think, emergent capacities that are now necessary for us to break through to the future you're describing. And we don't need to invent this capability. It's already there. And the traditions that we've been talking about have mapped it out. Science underpins it now and says, no, this is actually how reality works. It's not that separate, inert, vast, empty, disconnected, separate space that we grew up thinking.
Bob, I know we will speak again.
Yep.
We almost certainly will be speaking again before too very long. So thank you so much for sharing this space with me and for contributing towards my new book. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Well, Clive, it's been wonderful to be with you again. Thank you. It's been a fun conversation. Privilege.